Today's sermonette is about size. And I am making this statement. The Bible contains a number of statements in which we are referred to as seemingly small and, relatively speaking, virtually insignificant as a group, as a church. And we are primitive Christians, of course. I like to point that out because if we were modern Christians, we would be worshiping on Sunday. As primitive Christians, we keep the things which are considered primitive by the other churches. Those things which we keep in from the Bible and from the church in the New Testament era. Today's sermon, or sermonette, is entitled Little Flock. I call it Little Flock. It's from Luke's account. Luke gave an account, but so did Matthew, of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew starts the Sermon on the Mount in the 5th chapter of his book. And it is set forth as a keynote address that Christ gave to his ministry. When I say keynote, it's the first address, public address, that Christ seems to give there. And the meaning of a keynote is that it really sets forth so much of what you're going to say at that time and later. So this in Luke then comes much later in the book of Luke. It's in Luke chapter 12, and it's his account of Christ's Sermon on the Mount. And the two accounts are not exactly matching in what they have and the way that they're given. So Luke gives his much later than Matthew does. And he doesn't necessarily present it as a keynote address. Here's what Luke had to say. One of the things that Luke had to say in his account of the Sermon on the Mount. Well, no. Before we get to there, I'm just going to point out from Revelation chapter 4 and verse 6, because I just talked about the difference between the accounts given in Luke and Matthew, that Revelation chapter 4, verses 6 and 7 talk about these it calls them beasts at the throne. And this is an image or a vision of God's throne. Before the throne, it says, there was a sea of glass like crystal. And in the middle of the throne and round about the throne were 4 beasts. These 4 beasts were full of eyes before and behind, as though they can see into the future and look backwards into the past. The first beast was like a lion. Jesus Christ is called the Lion of the tribe of Judah. The second beast was like a calf, or an ox. The third beast had the face of a man. And the third gospel is the Gospel of Luke, the face of a man. The fourth beast was like a flying eagle. And so the Gospel of John we would relate to a flying eagle. And these 4 beasts, it calls them, are representative of the 4 different Gospels that we have in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. And lion, ox, man, and eagle. What I want to do in this sermonette is to look at what Christ says about his church as reported by Luke in the face of the man. So if you see some differences in the detail, of what Luke wrote versus what Matthew wrote, that's an explanation. They wrote for different purposes. They don't contradict each other, but one may include some things the other one doesn't include, and versa versa. And so that's interesting to note, but they're not contradictory. Luke, in his account, quotes Christ as calling his church a little flock. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 30 and going to verse 33. For all these things do the nations of the world seek after. And your Father knows you have need of these things. But rather, he's talking about all of the physical things of life that we could seek after or want in our own lives. And he says in verse 31, rather seek you, this is your priority as Luke presents it here, seek you the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Now that doesn't mean by fiat God's going to come down and suddenly provide me with everything that I want. But as time goes on, projecting on out prophetically into the future, if we are part of the first resurrection, we will be given the responsibility over all of these things. Seek you the kingdom of God, and all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock. We're a little flock, aren't we? I mean, we're rejoicing because we've got our attendance up close to 30. I don't know if we're at 30 or not, but we're pretty close. And so it's really good when one family can double the size of the attendance at the congregation, and that's really good. Of course, we have several families here, and they're not just a single one single family that's involved. Fear not, it is your Father's. Why do you not fear? It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Or seek after all of these things. You will be given these things ultimately, and control of a lot of these things for maybe the rest of all of mankind in the kingdom. Seek ye, Matthew says, first, the kingdom of God and his righteousness. Luke doesn't say that. And all these things shall be added unto you. Fear not, little flock. It is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. Sell what you have and give alms. Provide yourself bags which wax not old, a treasure in the heavens that faileth not, where no thief approaches, neither moth corrupts. The church has, for 2,000 years, been relatively small, although maybe in the earliest era it was a good bit bigger. But it waxes and wanes. Nevertheless, between when it grows larger at its apex, it's not really large enough to be considered large, or to get out of the category of still being small. Comparisons, or have we ever been the size of the Roman Catholic Church? Not since the first century. Orthodox Catholics, they're all over Eastern Europe. As you know, Hazel and I go to Eastern Europe. The Hills have been there a few times with us, and the Bells have been there. And we see a lot of Orthodox Catholics all over Eastern Europe, and they're a lot bigger than we are. We're sort of diminished with only a few people. Protestants, likewise, much larger than the primitive Christians are. And Baptists, for example, they can have a lot of people as part of their services. I had a lesson that I remembered from the Feast of Tabernacles 2012. At the end of the feast, we often have some sort of a meeting and discuss what was the most important lesson to you at this Feast of Tabernacles. 2012, I remember that question being asked. We had an individual there from the Toronto church, Maharanash Damania, and he said the most important lesson to him was that God was interested in quality, not in quantity. I had pretty much the same thought. Would God place before the feast? We were trying to organize a feast in Estonia, and the question there was, would God place his name there for a feast? It says we go to keep the feast where God has placed his name. Would God place his name on Estonia as one of the feast sites? So in our prayers at that time, we prayed to God and asked if he would want us to conduct a feast in Estonia. Please give us a sign that he was placing his name there. And we suggested a preliminary registration of 30 people. Here we are, about 30 people now. And we suggested that the sign he could give us might be at least 30 people. Now that doesn't sound like much of a Feast of Tabernacles, but it was a pretty good size for us at the time. We've been anywhere in Estonia, and I think I had counted 19 times that we've had the feast in Estonia since 1997. And we have had from 10 people at a Feast of Tabernacles there, all the way up to where we have had 90 in the low 90s at a single Feast of Tabernacles. So I thought if God would give us 30 names registering, that we would consider it that he wanted us to have the feast there. And so we waited and registration started, and lo and behold, we came up with precisely 30 names. And so we had the Feast of Tabernacles there at that time. Very small. And fear not, little flock, it is your Father's good pleasure. It's what he wants to do, to give you the kingdom. We are small. We, by comparison, have always sort of thought maybe we will become large before the end of this age, because the gospel of the kingdom, it tells us, is going to be preached to all the world for a witness to all nations. And it looks like it would take a really massive organization to do that. But we have not had any such massive organization. The latest numbers, I think, at the Feast of Tabernacles last year for the United Church of God, and I'm not making the statement that the United Church of God is all of God's church, because I'm very convinced it is not, and so is the Council of the United Church of God. We don't regard ourselves as being unique among all of the churches of God. There are plenty of people who are in Cagua. Well, it's a small part of a small part, and so we're a small part of a small part. We are very small We had between 6,000 and 7,000 people, as I remember it, last year at the feast. And there is a reason why we have been called such a small group, and I will be discussing that in the sermon.